When you think about the 1970s, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's kind of this awkward middle child of a decade. It's stuck right there between the massive changes of the 60s and the slick, shiny 80s. It's easy to just write it off as, well, a little forgettable.
Yeah, we all kind of picture the pop culture stuff, right? The disco, the bell-bottoms, maybe you've seen pictures of those cars just lined up for blocks and blocks waiting for gas. It's so easy to just caricature the whole decade as a time of, let's be honest, questionable taste and just a general feeling of national gloom.
But what if that's not the real story at all? What if the 1970s wasn't some kind of intermission, but was actually the Great Hinge, the foundational period when the world we're all living in right now was being forged? Okay, let's really get into this.
To really get the 70s, you have to start with the crises. That whole post-war American dream, the one built on the idea of cheap energy and America's undisputed place in the world, well, it started to fray, and then it just plain broke.
It all kicked off with oil. In 1973, as a response to U.S. support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, OPEC nations hit the brakes and declared an oil embargo. All of a sudden, the very engine of the American economy was just sputtering. It got so bad, the government had to step in and do things like lower the national speed limit. And just when it seemed like things were getting back to normal, boom, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 set off a second, even bigger shockwave.
Just look at that number. 4 times. In the aftermath of that 73 embargo, the price of gasoline nearly quadrupled. And this wasn't just some inconvenience, this was a deep, fundamental shock to the American way of life. It led to these massive shortages and this really jarring wake-up call that the country's prosperity was hanging by a thread held by foreign powers.
For the first time for a whole generation of Americans, foreign policy wasn't some abstract thing they read about in the newspaper. No, it was the price you paid at the pump. It was the length of the unemployment line. It was this feeling deep down that America was vulnerable. That solid confidence that had defined the country for decades, it was just evaporating.
But here's the thing. While all these huge economic and global crises were playing out on the big stage, a set of quieter but just as powerful revolutions were happening. They were totally reshaping American society, right from the inside out.
It's like the activism of the 1960s didn't just disappear, it went mainstream. There was this restlessness in the air, a widespread questioning of traditional authority that touched pretty much every part of society. People were challenging these long-held beliefs about gender, about identity, and about who really held the power.
Let's look at some of the specifics here, because they're huge. Women started breaking down barriers in the workplace, moving into careers in law, medicine, science, fields that had always been seen as men's territory. And in '79, Frances Dulesky made history on the board of what would eventually become the NASDAQ. At the same time, the LGBTQ+ rights movement was making these absolutely foundational gains. A major victory came in 1973, when the American Psychiatric Association officially stated that homosexuality was not a mental illness. Think about the impact of that. And then just a few years later, Harvey Milk's election in San Francisco became this powerful, shining symbol of hope and growing political strength.
So, as if all of that wasn't enough change for one decade, another revolution was quietly taking place, this one on tiny little slivers of silicon. While most of the country was worried about gas lines, a few engineers were literally building the future we all now live in.
The invention that changed everything was the microprocessor. Now, in simple terms, it's a whole central processing unit, a computer's brain, squeezed onto one tiny chip. But the real magic wasn't just that it was small. The real magic was that it was programmable. And this shift, this was a total game changer. See, before the 70s, most electronics were hardwired. That means a calculator could only ever be a calculator. If you wanted it to do something else, you had to physically redesign its circuits. The microprocessor changed all of that. Suddenly, one single, mass-produced chip could do a million different things just by changing the software that was running on it. This was the birth of the modern computer as we know it.
Now, I know this diagram looks like a bunch of complicated lines and boxes, but what you're really looking at is the engine of our modern world. Chips like the Intel 4004 and this one here, the Zilog Z80, were absolutely revolutionary. They were the engines inside the very first personal computers. They took computing out of these giant room-sized machines owned by big corporations, and for the first time ever, put that power into the hands of regular people. That democratized computing forever.
And this new digital power wasn't just for computer hobbyists in their garages. It fundamentally started changing how we all handle money. The first ATMs started popping up.
Banks began using electronic transfers to move money around. And then there was this seemingly boring little part of a 1978 tax law called Section 401k. It created the blueprint for how millions and millions of Americans save for retirement today.
And back on the global stage, as the decade was drawing to a close, America's changing role in the world was captured by two huge, defining dramas that were polar opposites.
On the one hand, you have this incredible moment of statesmanship and a breakthrough for peace. And on the other, you have this long, drawn-out crisis that broadcast an image of American weakness and helplessness to the entire world. The triumph? That was the Camp David Accords. After Egypt's President Sadat made this unbelievable historic visit to Israel, President Carter saw a window of opportunity and just seized it. He brought Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Begin to the presidential retreat at Camp David for 13 grueling, intense days of negotiations. The talks almost fell apart more than once, but Carter's sheer determination resulted in a historic framework for peace between two nations that had been enemies for decades.
And then came the trauma. This one number, it just says it all. It represents the agonizing, seemingly endless length of the Iran hostage crisis, which kicked off in November of 1979 when Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
For 444 days, this crisis just dominated American life. Every single night on the news, they would count the days of captivity. It was this constant, painful reminder of the 52 Americans being held hostage. The crisis completely eroded the country's confidence and was a huge factor in President Carter's loss in the 1980 election.
So when you pull all of these different threads together, the economic pain, the social revolutions, the birth of new technology, the highs and lows of foreign policy, you start to see a very clear picture. You see a decade that was anything but forgettable.
The legacy is just so clear when you lay it out like this. You can draw a straight line from then to now. The energy crises, they forced a focus on fuel efficiency and alternative energy that continues to this day. The microprocessor, it's the direct ancestor of the smartphone in your pocket and the internet itself. The social movements, they led to a more inclusive, though still imperfect society. That 401k law redefined how we save for retirement. And the Iran hostage crisis, it fundamentally changed U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East forever. The connections, they're just undeniable.
And that's really the story of the 1970s. It was the decade of the Great Shift. The turmoil and the crises, they shattered the old world, the world of the post-war era. But at the exact same time, all these quiet, persistent revolutions in technology, in social structures, and in finance were busy building the foundation of the world we all recognize today.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you look at the challenges we face today, the innovations that are happening all around us, what foundations are we laying down right now? 50 years from now, what will people point to as the great hinge of our time?